Chapter 6: Revolution versus Reactionary. What the Waffen-SS could have finally achieved toward a European confederation, what caliber of leadership the Adolf Hitler schools would have produced, or how education and advancement of Germany's non-affluent classes might have reshaped the nation will never be known. Military defeat in 1945 ended the era of German self-determination, quelling a revolution of historical consequence that may never be emulated. Germany's overthrow we broadly attribute to the larger populations and superior industrial capacity of the Allies, but a seldom publicized insidious factor also contributed to the outcome of the war. This was the systemic sabotage, conducted by disaffected, malevolent elements within Germany, of the Reich's peacetime diplomacy and wartime military operations. Unlike the Bolsheviks, Hitler did not oppose the aristocracy to promote labor. He personally considered the role of the nobility played out. It would have to prove itself to regain its former prestige, but only by competing against classes within the parameters of the Reich's social programs. A tract published for officers declared, "The new nobility of the German nation, which is open to every German, is nobility based on accomplishment." Many from the country's titled families accepted the challenge. They enrolled in the NSDAP or the SS or served with valor in the armed forces during the war. A small percentage concentrated in the Army General Staff and in the diplomatic corps resented the social devaluation of their high-born status. Rather than contribute to the new Germany, they conspired against her. Together with the self-absorbed minority of misguided intellectuals, clerics, financiers, and Marxists, they intrigued to bring down both the National Socialist government and their country as well. As especially harmful characteristic of this subversive resistance movement was that its leaders tenanted sensitive positions in public office and in the military. Major players included Leipzig's Mayor Karl Godeler, Ribbentrop subordinates Baron von Weizsäcker, Ewald von Kleist-Schmessen and Erich Kort, and Chief of Military Intelligence Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. They and their fellow conspirators knew that Hitler was too popular for them to incite a national insurrection against him. They sought assistance beyond Germany's borders from England. The subversives established contact with British politicians in June 1937. With Canaris providing a screen, Godeler covertly traveled to London using foreign currency provided by the banker Schacht. He met with Halifax, Churchill, Eden, Vansittart, and Montague Norman of the Bank of England. Godeler told his hosts of an approaching unavoidable confrontation between Hitler and the conspirators, giving the impression that plans for a coup were well underway. That December, Ribbentrop submitted to Hitler a confidential analysis of attitudes in Britain. He warned that the English were by no means weak and decadent and would go to war were German ambitions considered a threat to their empire. In secret discussions with Vansittart, Churchill, and British diplomats, Weizsäcker falsely claimed the opposite, that Ribbentrop was advising the Führer that London was too spineless to seriously oppose the Reich. During the Sudetenland crisis in the summer of 1938, the resistance attempted to persuade the British to reject Hitler's proposed territorial revisions. Its envoy, Kleist-Schmessen, was a patrician landowner and monarchist. He enjoyed a certain reference among peers for his fight to reduce the wages of Pomerania's farmers during the 1920s. He once maintained, the nobility must adhere to the sovereign manner developed over centuries, the feeling of being master, the uncompromising feeling of superiority. On August 9th, Kleist-Schmessen told Churchill that in the event of war, German generals were prepared to assist in a revolt to establish a new government in Berlin within 48 hours. The envoy also supplied the British Secret Service with classified information regarding the Reich's defense capabilities. Just as Godeler had previously described German rearmament as a colossal bluff in London the years before, Kleist-Schmessen told the English that the German army was unprepared for war. The British agent Jan Colvin wrote later that every single sentence Kleist uttered would suffice on its own to earn him a death sentence for treason. The back gate of number 10 Downing Street swung open in the evening of September 7, 1938, to admit Erich Kort with a private letter from Weizsäcker for Halifax. The German baron wrote of how the leaders of the army are ready to resort to armed forces against Hitler's policy, A diplomatic defeat would represent a very serious setback for Hitler and Germany, and in fact precipitate the end of the National Socialist regime. Thanks to his lofty position of the Reich's Foreign Office, Weizsäcker knew that the Führer's determination to recover the Sudetenland was no bluff. By encouraging London toward a showdown, he hoped to provoke an armed confrontation. Chamberlain, however, received more accurate reports from his ambassador in Berlin. Henderson had already written Under Secretary Cadogan in July that although Hitler did not want war, the Germans were preparing for every eventuality. The astute Henderson also lanced Weizsäcker's mendacious claim that Ribbentrop was advising the Führer that the British have no backbone. Certainly Ribbentrop did not give me the impression he thought we were averse of war. Quite the contrary, he seems to think we were seeking it. Chamberlain prudently concluded the Munich Accord with Hitler on September 30, peacefully transferring the Sudetenland to Germany. The resistance movement considered this a crushing defeat for its machinations. Disappointed, Court declared that the best solution would have been war. Undaunted, its members exploited covert diplomatic channels to flood London with more bogus news about Germany. Godler told the English on October 18th how supposedly Ribbentrop was boasting that Chamberlain signed the death sentence of the British Empire in Munich. Hitler will now pursue a relentless path to destroy the empire. As the Polish crisis charged the diplomatic atmosphere in the summer of 1939, the resistance against poured oil on the fire. After meeting with Danzig's Commissioner Burkhardt in June, the British diplomat Roger Mackens stated in a Foreign Office memo, Great Britain should continue to show an absolutely firm front. This is the course advocated by Baron von Weizsäcker and by most well-disposed Germans. Assistant Under-Secretary Sargent summarized, Weizsäcker is constant in his advice that the only thing which makes Hitler see reason is the maintenance of a firm front and no premature offer to negotiate under pressure. Weizsäcker, the number 2 man in German foreign affairs, contributed to the inflexibility of the other side. The resistance continued to supply Chamberlain with descriptions alleging the desperate economic situation in Germany, Hitler's unpopularity, and their army's readiness to mutiny. The better-informed British emissaries in Berlin maintained a sober perspective. Henderson's subordinate, Ogilvy Forbes, wrote Halifax about the conspirators on July 4, 1939. I have a deep-rooted mistrust of their advice and their information. They are quite powerless to get rid of the Nazi leaders by their own efforts, and they place all their hopes for this purpose in war with England and the defeat of Germany. One can have little respect for or confidence in Germans for whom the destruction of a regime is a higher aim than the success in war of their own country. Despite such warnings, Henderson saw with dismay how his government based some policy decisions on intelligence provided by the resistance movement. To be sure, Chamberlain was aware of the risk posed by war. An all-out conflict with Germany would compel England to seek American aid, increasing U.S. influence abroad. Waging war against the Reich was therefore contingent on an immediate collapse of enemy resistance. Told by conspirators in August 1939 that German generals anxiously await London's declarations of war so that they can topple the government and that Hitler is on the verge of a nervous breakdown, Britain's Prime Minister reacted. The director of the Central European section of the British Secret Service, Sisselman Best, recalled, at the outbreak of the war, our intelligence service had reliable information that Hitler faced the opposition of many men who occupied the highest functions in his armed forces and public offices. According to our information, this opposition movement had assumed such proportions as to be able to lead to a revolt and overthrow the Nazis. French Foreign Minister Bonnet wrote in his memoirs, We expected an easy and rapid victory. The declaration of war by England and France on Germany of September 3 was supposed to be the way for the military coup to be cleared, and we were promised. General Gamelin told Benoit Machine, I don't anticipate having to deal with the German army. Hitler will be ousted the day we declare war. Right after the war's start, Chamberlain noted in his diary, What I hope for is not a military victory. I doubt very much that is possible, but a collapse of the German home front. Ribbentrop himself wrote in 1946, We didn't know then that London was counting on the conspiratorial group of prominent military men and politicians, therefore came to hope for an easy victory over Germany. Their circle of conspirators in this way played a decisive role in the outbreak of the war. They thwarted all of our efforts to seek a peaceful solution, and very likely tipped the scales for the English decision to declare war. Germany's campaigns in World War II are a popular subject for study by historians and military analysts. However, when researching Hitler's strategies, successes, and failures, few take into account the pernicious influence of the resistance movement. Such as turncoats in the diplomatic service helped block an understanding with England in 1939. High-ranking members of the army consistently disrupted the war effort once hostilities opened. Though less than 5% of German army officers identified with those betraying their country, the unfaithful few often occupied positions in planning and logistics, enabling them to cause havoc disproportionate to their number. The Gestapo eventually maintained a watch list, but generally did not investigate the army. This allowed subversion of combat operations to continue virtually undetected. The Prussian aristocrat Fabian von Schlabrendorf, a staff officer and remoteless saboteur, expressed the spirit of the plotters. Preventing Hitler's success under any circumstances and through whatever means necessary, even at the cost of a crushing defeat of the German realm, was our most urgent task. Appointments to key posts in the General Staff gave the conspirators insight into military strategy as it was formulated, information they communicated to the enemy. The former Army Chief of Staff Tedor testified in 1955, almost all German attacks immediately after being planned by the OKW became known to the enemy before they even landed on my desk. The German armed forces lacked the element of surprise from the first day of the fighting. On August 30th, 1939, 2 days before Germany invaded Poland, Clyde Schmidson delivered the detailed operational orders to the British Embassy in Berlin, with instructions to pass this on to Warsaw. Chamberlain duly forwarded the documents to Colonel Beck. A few months after the Polish campaign, a member of the Reich's Foreign Office in Berlin who was smuggling microfilm was arrested by the SD. The film contained precise information about the strength and location of the German occupational forces in Poland. The former SD chief wrote later, "In the OKW, they were more than a little surprised at such an accurate and comprehensive report, especially as the statistics were correct to the smallest detail." He speculated that the only senior German officers could have provided the material. Among the loosely affiliated subversive groups, military intelligence, the Abwehr, was especially destructive. Its chief, Canaris, was a master of disinformation. His memoirs, Grand Admiral Karl Dones, stated that the Abwehr delivered not a single useful report about the enemy throughout the entire war. Canaris recruited the equestrian monarchist Hans Oster to run the central department of the agency. A general staff officer during World War I, Oster had left the army in 1932 for violating its code of honor. Canaris reinstated him as an ersatz lieutenant colonel in 1935. When war broke out anew, Oster began drawing acquaintances hostile to the state and to the Abwehr as specialists. From October 1939 on, Oster furnished copies of every agency report plus whatever could be obtained from the OKW to the Dutch military attaché in Berlin, Colonel Gijsbertus Sass. He urged Sass to use the information to reinforce Holland's defenses against Germany and to relay the reports to the Western powers. On April 3, 1940, Oster provided him the details of the imminent German invasion of Norway in order for him to forewarn Oslo. 1 month later, Oster gave Sass the target date of the German surprise offensive in the West. The Dutch disbelieved the information, similarly instructed Belgium Ambassador Adrian Newern, who opined skeptically no German would do something like that. Believing to have tipped the Allies off in time, Oster calculated that the abortive offensive would cost the German army 40,000 dead. In his own words, he still considered himself a better German than all those who run after Hitler. German telephone security personnel monitoring the Dutch embassy line knew that Sass had received classified intelligence about the Western campaign, but weren't able to localize the source. To divert suspicion, Oster tried to frame Baroness Steenstraft, the wife of a German diplomat. Only Ribbentrop's intervention prevented Oster, the son of a pastor, from using the Abwehr's resources to implicate an innocent woman for treason. Canaris not only protected Oster, but betrayed military secrets on his own. The fact that he had served as a U-boat captain during World War I did not prevent Canaris from providing the British Secret Service with details of German submarine development during the 1930s. Senior Abwehr officers profited from the war, accepting bribes in exchange for draft developments, and the police arrested Hans van Donoye, a specialist recruited by Oster for public graft. Abwehr directors in Munich sold paintings, tapestries, and currencies on the black market. Canaris himself arranged for his agency courier plane to regularly fly on fresh strawberries for himself from Spain. Where corruption and incompetence became so rife that Hitler eventually relieved the crafty admiral of his post and placed the agency under Himmler. The house cleaning, however, was far off in 1940, when Canaris struck another serious blow to the German cause. After London rejected Hitler's generous peace offer that July, the Fuhrer contemplated how to continue the war against England. Considering an amphibious invasion of the British Isles too risky, he decided to attack the enemy's overseas possessions. Capture of the British base at Gibraltar, controlling the nautical lifeline to Egypt and the Suez Canal, was an option. Not only would the conquest virtually cripple England's position in the Mediterranean, but the operation was within Germany's resources. Prerequisite was Spain entering the war on the German side, and Madrid already favored Germany and Italy. In July 1940, the Spanish head of state, Francisco Franco, publicly stated, "Control of Gibraltar and expansion into Africa is both the duty and calling of Spain." On the 19th, he announced his willingness to declare war on Britain, adding, "In this case, some support by Germany would be necessary for the attack on Gibraltar." Hitler could transfer troops to southern Spain to stage the expedition against the strategic English base. Berlin sent Canaris to negotiate the alliance because of his good relations with prominent Spaniards. In collusion with Weizsäcker, however, he accomplished the opposite by privately informing Franco that Germany's position was desperate, with almost no hope of winning the war. He advised his host to keep Spain neutral, reassuring him that Hitler would not send troops into Spain to force Madrid's cooperation. Had Canaris persuaded Franco to support the Reich, it's more than possible that such a decision by Spain at this moment would have meant the end of the war, wrote Spanish Foreign Minister Serrano sooner. With Germany's position thus strengthened, Hitler would have possessed a more formidable hand when dealing with Molotov that November. He may have been able to resolve his differences with the USSR without resorting to arms. Germany possessed a superb intelligence-gathering network for the war in the East. Her specialists had already cracked the complex Soviet radio encryption and monitored its traffic. Since 1934, codebreakers at the Hisarleben installation had been tapped into secure telephone lines connecting Moscow to its European embassies. In 1937, the Germans began deciphering Soviet phototelegraphic communications. In addition to reading diplomatic correspondence, they gained knowledge of Russian armaments production, the location and capacity of the factories, of the shortfalls in industry. Theodor Worrell's long-range reconnaissance squadron, subordinate to the Luftwaffe Supreme Command, flew high-altitude missions over the USSR beginning in 1935. Aircrews photographed Soviet naval installations, armaments and industrial complexes, military fortifications and troop concentrations. Thousands of pictures of the Russian interior provided ample images to produce accurate maps. In 1947, the USA used Worrell's photographs to prepare its own maps of the Soviet Union. During the first weeks of the Russian campaign, advancing German troops captured many official documents which Soviet administrators had failed to destroy or evacuate. The cache offered a comprehensive picture of the USSR's infrastructure, analysis of civilian attitudes, and so forth. Luftwaffe communication specialists deciphered Soviet military radio traffic, promptly and consistently delivering details about Russian troop strength, status of available ammunition and fuel, planned aerial and ground attacks, and marching routes of enemy divisions. The post-war American Seaborne Report concluded that German codebreakers maintained 80% accuracy in their knowledge of all planned Soviet military operations and armaments production. Monitoring stations forwarded this vast quantity of intelligence to the Abwehr for assessment. Canaris, Oster, and fellow conspirators relayed almost none of the findings to Hitler. They instead stored the cache of documents in Angerburg, East Prussia, never evaluated. Military cartographers prepared maps of the East without referencing Worrell's pictures. Some they based on Russian maps that had been printed in 1865. The German army received inaccurate ones depicting dirt roads which became impassable quagmires after rainfall, as modern paved highways. This misinformation often confounded the tactical advance of German mechanized forces. They occasionally approached towns that were not even shown on the maps. Shortly before the Russian campaign began, members of the German military mission in Romania had already learned from locals and from Red Army deserters of the formidable new Soviet armor sighted during Stalin's occupation of Bessarabia. Witnesses provided details about the Russian KV-1 and KV-2 heavy tanks, plus sketches of a third model that was faster, well-armored, and boasting equally good firepower. George Pemler, a reconnaissance flight officer, pored over aerial photographs taken by Rural Squadron over the Pruth and Dniester River areas. He discovered images depicting the military tank on railroad flat cars en route to Red Army units stationed near the Reich's frontier. Called by Pemmler to examine the pictures, Romanian Colonel Crescu told him, "Until now, we thought this tank is still in development and being tested. The manufacture has progressed so far, the troops are already receiving deliveries. It is a discovery of great importance. The Supreme Command must be informed of this at once." Gathering the photographs and relevant data, Pemmler personally flew to Berlin to disclose his findings. Intelligence officers accepted his report but did not forward it to the OKW. When the new Soviet tank, the T-34, appeared in battle in June 1941, it shocked German frontline troops. Its innovative sloping armor was too thick for German tank guns to penetrate, and it rendered German anti-tank ordnance obsolete. While German intelligence concealed Soviet armaments capability from OKW planners, Canaris assured Hitler that only one single-track railroad joined the Russian source of raw materials in the Urals to industrial centers in Moscow. An Abwehr liaison in Romania, Dr. Barth, told his associate Pemmler, "The leadership of the armed forces is grossly underestimating the strength of the Red Army. I personally can't avoid the impression that this is even promoted by certain men. We have confirmed confidential information, for example, that in one particular tank factory around 25 heavy tanks are produced daily. Since then, we've identified 3 such plans. The Chief of the General Staff scribbles a question mark here, sending the report back for reevaluation without informing the Fuhrer." Barth was referring to Hayter, who had become Chief of Staff in September 1938. A post-war denazification panel judged Hayter's earlier conduct a complete betrayal of his country. After the conquest of Poland in 1939, he formed a secret planning staff to overthrow the government and place General Heinrich von Steubenagel in charge, who one German historian described with admiration as an old-school European nobleman. Hayter urged Hitler to invade Russia, downplaying the hazards of the campaign. On February 3, 1941, Hitler directed Foreign Armies East, a branch of military intelligence, to assess the Red Army's ability to deploy large formations in the expansive Pripyat marshland. This consisted of swampy terrain in the south-center sector of the future front. Receiving the finished report on the 12th, Hayter made an alteration before forwarding it to the Fuhrer. He deleted the assessment's conclusion that it would be possible for the Russians to shift troops within the marsh, thus posing a threat to the flank and near of advancing German divisions. Based on this evaluation, the OKH did not allow formations to guard the southern periphery of the wetlands to screen the planned thrust of the German 6th Army and 1st Panzer Army toward Kiev. Soon after hostilities broke out, the Soviet Fifth Army, transferred south via Pripyat's railroad network, assaulted the open left flank of the German Sixth Army. This compelled Hitler to halt the advance on July 10th. The capture of Kiev by the beginning of July 1941, barely 3 weeks into the campaign, would have been entirely possible but was prevented by strong Soviet forces operating from out of the Pripyat marshlands, concluded the military historian Edwald Klapdor. Unable to continue the advance without infantry support from the Sixth Army, the First Panzer Army became deadlocked in costly battles of attrition against frontally attacking Russian divisions for another 7 weeks. 2 months into the campaign, Hitler remarked that the entire operation would have been planned differently had he known the enemy's actual disposition and strength. Once the invasion began, the Soviets received timely reports on German military operations from the Supreme Command of the Army, the OKH, right from Hitler's headquarters. The communications chief there, General Erich Feigl, secretly installed a direct telephone line to Switzerland to transmit classified information. Stationed in Bern was Hans Josephus, another of Canaris' Abwehr specialists. He relayed the report to Moscow. Other agents in Switzerland, such as Rudolf Rössler, participated, identified but tolerated by Swiss intelligence. The sophisticated espionage network was nicknamed the Red Orchestra by the SD. Schellenberg wrote later that the information, if leaked, could only come from the highest German sources. When the SD finally shut down the spy ring in 1942, it arrested 146 suspected operatives in Berlin alone. The courts condemned 86 of them to death for treason. They had transmitted over 500 detailed reports to the Kremlin. In October 1942, the Gestapo arrested 70 more communist operatives in the Reich's Air Ministry and in the Bureau for Aerial Armaments. On June 22, 1941, the Red Army possessed 25,508 tanks, 18,700 combat aircraft, and 5,774,000 soldiers. There were 79,100 cannons distributed among the 303 divisions deployed in the first and second waves. Hitler took on this force with crucial information withheld, his intelligence agencies consciously understating enemy resources, and officers forewarning the enemy of German attacks. On August 1st, 5 weeks into the campaign, the Red Army deployed 269 divisions, 46 of them armored, and 18 brigades against the invaders. An intelligence report the Fuhrer received 2 weeks earlier had fixed Russian strength at just 50 rifle divisions and 8 tank divisions. On August 10th, German soldiers overran the command post of the Soviet 16th Army east of Smolensk. The field police discovered copies of 2 AKH plans for the German attack. They found another German operational plan upon capturing Bryansk soon after, which the OKH had presented to Hitler on August 18th. Eusebius later boasted, "We had our spies all over the War Ministry, in the police, in the Ministry of the Interior, especially in the Foreign Office, all threads connecting to Oster." Advanced knowledge of German plans helped the Red Army embroil the invaders in heavy fighting around Smolensk in July and August. The Germans regained the initiative when Hitler decided on August 21st to shift his panzer division southward toward Kiev. The senseless operation now decided upon, fumed Tedor in his diary. "We'll scatter our forces and stall the advance on Moscow." The Germans, in fact, destroyed 4 Soviet armies and mauled a 5th around Kiev. An immense battle of encirclement, capturing much of the Ukraine. Hitler told his architect Geisler, "I saw in these flanking thrusts and envelopments the only chance of beating the Russians. Mass formations. I had to literally wrest operations away from my generals. Not even this success persuaded my generals of the only possible strategy in Russia." Weary of wrangling, the Fuhrer ultimately endorsed Tedor's brainchild, a frontal attack against Moscow. Operation Typhoon began on October 1st, but deception and sabotage determined the outcome. Quartermaster General Wagner reported the stockpile of provisions for the attack to be satisfactory. Again, the minimum requirement of 24 supply chains per day for Army Group Center. However, between 8 and 15 reached the front daily during August, 12 in September. Even during fair weather, hundreds of fully laden freight trains sat idle in switch yards between Berlin and Krakow. Largely responsible for the delay in supplies was the director of Main Rail Transport South, Erwin Landenberger in Kiev, and the director of Main Rail Transport Center, Karl Hahn in Minsk. Hitler ordered both men arrested for sabotage. Released from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp months later, Hahn described himself to another officer as a mortal enemy of the Nazis. Hitler personally selected their replacements, Erhard Milch and Albert Speer, assumed responsibility for getting the trains rolling again. The situation improved within weeks. Speer prioritized locomotive manufacture, which Milch reorganized rail and canal transportation to the front. Milch warned subordinates, "I have permission to hang any railroad official from a tree, including senior managers, and I will do it." The OKH gradually reduced Army Group Center striking power during Typhoon. On October 11th, it transferred away the 8th Army Corps with 3 divisions and the 1st Cavalry Division. The 5th, 8th, and 15th Infantry Division soon followed. The 9th Army Corps with 4 divisions went into reserve. On November 3rd, the OKH announced the intention to withdraw 7 panzer divisions from the Eastern Front for replenishment. At the same time, the Luftwaffe sent nearly a fourth of its personnel in Russia on leave. The High Command transferred out 13 fighter groups, leaving just 3 groups of Fighter Squadron 51 left to support the offensive from the air. Typhoon made progress nonetheless. Northwest of Moscow, the 1st Panzer Division took Kalinin. Instead of wheeling southeast to invest the capital, the troops advanced northward. Eyewitness Karl Wagner recalled, "The capture of Kalinin opened a great tactical opportunity for us. We now held the cornerstone of Moscow's defense system and could push toward the poorly secured northern flank of the city. The place was ours for the taking, with good roads and less than a day's travel time. Instead, our panzers and the 9th Infantry Army supported us, received the order to attack the completely insignificant town of Torzhok, more than 100 miles north of Kalinin. We felt that the new directive from the OKH didn't make any sense. The worst handicap confronting German combatants was the death of cold weather gear. The Reich's industry had manufactured enough quilted winter uniforms to equip at least 56 divisions. Also, prefabricated shelters and barracks heaters had been loaded into 255 freight trains awaiting rail transport east. On November 1st, Hitler inspected winter apparel earmarked for the Russian front, and Quartermaster Wagner assured him that the gear was already en route to the field armies in sufficient quantity. 9 days later, Wagner confided to Hayter that most quilted uniforms would not go forward until the end of January. They remained loaded on trains in Warsaw for months. Hitler did not learn of the shortages until December 20, when General Heinz Guderian flew in from the Central Front and told him. Luftwaffe personnel all received cold weather apparel, only thanks to Milch's personal supervision. The OKH was no less remiss about advising Hitler of intelligence reports predicting a planned Soviet counteroffensive. During November, the Russians transferred most of their Siberian rifle divisions from the Far East to the Moscow sector. German aerial reconnaissance monitored the augmenting concentration of enemy reserves. Long-range observation planes reported an alarming increase in the number of Soviet transport trains conveying fresh formations to the Kalin and Moscow sector. The OKH disregarded the information. Sweden supplied the Germans with accurate statistics of the planning and scope of the approaching Red Army offensive, but the Abwehr group receiving this intelligence did not forward it to Berlin. In mid-November, Foreign Armies East assessed the Soviet divisions are 50% under strength, with more than half the officers and men untrained. In fact, however, many of the 88 rifle divisions, 15 cavalry divisions, and 24 armored brigades about to attack the German lines were well equipped at full roster. On the evening of December 4, 1941, only hours before the onslaught began, Foreign Armies East concluded that the combat effectiveness of the Red Army is insufficient for the Russian to be capable of a major offensive at this time, unless he introduces significant reinforcements. The end of its strength, caught by surprise, the ill-clad German army gave ground that winter. Hitler was exasperated over the failure to realize his strategic concept in the face of opposition from the General Staff. He cited the total underestimation of the enemy, the false reports of enemy reserves, and of the strength of his armaments, and incomprehensible treason as contributing to the German army's first major defeat of the war. Despite the retreat before Moscow, the Germans maintained favorable position for a 1942 campaign. Hitler fixed the main thrust toward the Caucasus mountain range, the oil fields and refineries of which supplied 80% of the USSR's petroleum. He ordered Army Group South correspondingly reinforced. With the capture of Varennes on July 8 of 1942, the German panzer divisions were poised to cross the Don River, but the Führer initially forbade the crossing. Not wanting to weaken the offensive by splitting his forces, he commanded instead that the 4th Panzer Army turn south to join the main advance toward the oil fields. Soviet formations in the south were in retreat and seriously demoralized. German radio specialists arrested 2 former Polish army officers in a Warsaw suburb who transmitted detailed information to Moscow about the Caucasus offensive. Abwehr officials, the rank and file of whom did not share the treasonous sentiments of Canaris and Oster, reported this to the Führer's headquarters. It revealed that Stalin knew about the Germans' military preparations. Receiving the report, General Feldgeibel decided that it was too alarming and it would only upset the Führer. He buried the news. With the element of surprise compromised, Army Group South began Operation Blue on July 28th. Army Group A pushed toward the Caucasus. The Northeast Army Group B consecutively advanced on Stalingrad to cover the flank. This was an industrial complex strung along the Volga River, notorious for the working population's primitive housing. Hitler's operational plan called for the destruction of Stalingrad's arms production through bombardment or siege. Capture of the metropolis was not an express goal. The Caucasus was the primary objective of the campaign. The High Command soon watered down the offensive. Hyder wrote in his diary on June 30th that the chief of the OKW staff, Alfred Jodl, had told Hitler during a situation conference, with great emphasis, that the fate of the Caucasus will be decided at Stalingrad, therefore necessary to transfer elements of Army Group A to B in new packaging, an idea served up that I had introduced to the Führer 6 days earlier. Hayter shifted the 4th Panzer Army from the southern front on July 30 to serve as the spearhead for the attack on Stalingrad. Despite protests from Army Group A's field commanders, Halder only took away the elite motorized infantry division. One historian summarized, now 2 equally strong army groups with almost the same number of panzer and motorized formations were operating in 2 different directions. The northern group attacked with 4 panzer and 3 motorized divisions, the southern group with 3 panzer and 3 motorized divisions. The formations slotted for the main purpose of the campaign were weaker than those covering the flank. Army Group South proved unable to conquer the Caucasus region, which would have paralyzed the Red Army's capacity to conduct offensive operations. The Northern force became bogged down in a costly and pointless effort to capture Stalingrad. During the advance toward the Caucasus, the OKH robbed Army Group A of another trump, the 60,000-man Italian Alpine Corps. This consisted of 3 well-trained mountain divisions, each of them equipped with 5,000 pack mules. Instead of deploying the elite corps of the mountains, the OKH directed it to march northward to reinforce Stalingrad. Thus, the soldiers, clad in wool uniforms for wear in the cooler, high-altitude climate, began a punishing foot march in warm weather across the Asian steppe. As mountain divisions, they possessed no anti-tank guns or heavy artillery, making them virtually defenseless against Soviet armor. On August 27, General Rinaldo Dell'Arme wrote Mussolini about the Corps orders. "We came to Russia certain to go to the Caucasus superbly suited for our training, weapons, and equipment. And there we could join the best German and Romanian mountain divisions in an almost sport-like competition to achieve the most. Then we were redirected into the Don region, into flat territory and without adequate weapons. We received rifles from 1891 and 4 ridiculously small cannons useless against the Russian 34-ton tanks. There are only so many Alpini. That's not a human resource that should be treated frivolously." The southern offensive floundered when a major Soviet attack struck Army Group B in November. This compelled Army Group A to retreat from the Caucasus to avoid being flanked. The Russians surrounded and destroyed the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Historians blame Hitler for the catastrophe, but the verdict does not weigh the flagrant disregard of his orders, misleading intelligence he received, or military senseless troops movements carried out by the OKH without his knowledge. For instance, the left flank of Army Group B ran southeastward along the Don River from Varennes to Stalingrad. Defending the positions were the German Sixth Army, the 4th Panzer Army covering the right flank. Hitler knew that the poorly equipped foreign contingents could not repulse a potentially Soviet offensive. In August, he ordered the 22nd Panzer 2 infantry divisions transferred to support the Italian 8th Army. The Hungarians were also to receive reinforcements, including heavy artillery and new German 75mm anti-tank guns. Halder virtually ignored the order, dispatching only weak token units a few weeks later. In later October, the Führer directed that the crack 6th Panzer Division and 2 more infantry divisions be shifted from France to buttress the Romanians and Italians. The OKH delayed the full transfer of these formations until December. It was equally tardy about stationing new Luftwaffe field divisions behind the armies of Germany's allies, as Hitler had called for. The 22nd Panzer Division, which he thought was at full strength, sorely needed replenishment. Of its 104 panzers, just 32 were operational. The OKH concealed this fact from the commander-in-chief. On September 9 and 16, the war diary of the OKW staff recorded Hitler's orders to reinforce the Italian 8th Army. The diary noted on October 6, "The Führer repeats his anxiety over a major Russian attack, perhaps even a winter offensive in the sector of our allies' armies, driving across the Don toward Rostov. The reason for apprehension includes strong enemy troop movements and bridge building over the Don in many places." Once more, the OKW diary from November 5th. "The feared Russian attack over the Don is again discussed. The number of bridges under construction there is constantly growing. The Luftwaffe wants to show pictures. The Führer's orders strong air attacks against the bridge sites and suspects enemy assembly areas in the wood along the banks." Reconnaissance confirmed Hitler's concerns. From the comparatively high ground, they defended southwest of Sirochinskaya. Men on the 44th Infantry Division observed concentrations of Soviet troops and material along the Don, opposite positions of the Romanian Third Army. In a nearby sector, Russian deserters told Italian interrogators that they had been ordered to remain in concealment during the day. The Abwehr liaison to whom the Italians relayed the intelligence replied that general aerial observation was more credible and had reported nothing, when in fact the opposite was true. Max Ladoga, a radio man with the long-range reconnaissance squadron, wrote, "The Russians there are constantly bringing up strong reinforcements. Our daily flights have captured it all, filmed it all, and reported it." The observer Pemler recalled that flight crews sent timely warnings up the chain of command, which no one took seriously. Other sources delivered details of Red Army preparations. The Abwehr had launched Operation Zeppelin in July 1942, during which hundreds of anti-communist Russians parachuted behind Soviet lines and provided information to the Germans. Over the next several months, they counted 3,269 railroad trains ferrying Soviet troops toward the Stalingrad combat zone, plus another 1,056 trains carrying war material. German aerial reconnaissance discovered on November 10th that the Russians had transferred the 5th Tank Army there as well. On November 11th, the command of the Communications Evaluation Section 1 submitted to the OKH a comprehensive analysis of intercepted Soviet military radio traffic. It identified enemy reserves transferred to the Stalingrad area of operations. The report accurately predicted that the Russians were about to launch a pincer attack to surround the German Sixth Army. The deployment may already be substantially progressing. Foreign Armies East was responsible for assessing these reports in the spring of 1942. Halder had arranged for his former adjutant, Reinhard Gehlen, to become its chief. Believing, like Hindenburg, that Germany should not be governed by a Bohemian corporal, Gehlen later acknowledged actively supporting the resistance. In August 1942, he reported with a straight face that since the previous February, due to a shortage of officers, the Red Army had not formed a single new combat division. Gehlen disclosed to Hitler neither the progress of Zeppelin nor the proximity of the 5th Tank Army, which he claimed was stationed far to the north. Even though the Red Army had massed 66% of its armor opposite Army Group B, Gehlen warned that the Russians were planning instead to attack near Smolensk farther north. He reassured the Führer's headquarters on November 11th, "There is no indication of a possible attack soon. Available forces are too weak for major operations." The Russian offensive began on November 19, 1942. Tanks steamrolled the Romanian positions as Hitler had feared. In a major pincer operation, they drove southward to surround Stalingrad. The Soviet 57th Army plunged headlong into General Hans-Georg Leiser's full-strength, motorized 29th Infantry Division, which counterattacked without authorization from the General Staff. Its 55 tanks of Panzer Battalion 129 struck furiously along a railroad line, detaining masses of surprise Russian infantrymen and supplies. Sealing off this enemy's penetration, the 29th turned southwest to assault the flanks of the Soviet 4th Corps. Before the operation began, the division received the suspicious order to break contact and withdraw into the Stalingrad perimeter. This enabled the Russians to continue their encirclement of the Sixth Army. Believing that the Luftwaffe could airlift sufficient supplies into Stalingrad, but also based on the Gehlen's report that the Soviets had no reserves left, Hitler decided to supply the trapped garrison by air until a relief operation could be prepared. Junkers transport planes and Heinkel bombers delivered provisions to the Sixth Army's airfields and evacuated wounded on return flights out. Organizing the missions was Quartermaster Colonel Eberhard Fink. An active conspirator, he arranged for a substantial number of flights to carry useless cargo. In addition to food, medical supplies, and ammunition, the beleaguered troops at Stalingrad received thousands of old newspapers, candy, false collars, barbed wire, roofing paper, 4 tons of margarine and pepper, 200,000 pocketbooks, shoelaces, spices, and so on. The German army launched a relief expedition on December 13th, spearheaded by General Erhard Raus' 6th Panzer Division. 10% above full strength. The formation possessed 160 tanks, including Panzer IVs fitted with a new high-velocity cannon, 4,200 trucks, 20 heavy armored cars, and 42 self-propelled assault guns. The 17th and 23rd Panzer Divisions, which had been weakened by constant fighting that autumn, took part in the operation. The attack progressed to within 30 miles of Stalingrad, some 50 miles west. Soviet tanks counterattacked and captured the airfield at Morozovaskaya, threatening the German flank on the lower Chir River. Instead of dispatching weaker covering units to plug the gap, the High Command transferred the 6th Panzer Division to the Chir position. This, in the opinion of the historian and former Waffen-SS Lieutenant Heinz Schmock, was pure overkill. 2 weeks later, I myself was commander of a strong point on the Donez River, which was completely frozen over with 2 bridges. I held the position there for 10 days and nights against a vastly superior Russian force. No one could tell me that the Chir front could not have held out for 1 more day, until contact with the surrounded 6th Army was established. When on December 23rd, the 6th Panzer Division received the incomprehensible order to withdraw from the relief operation, its officers at first assumed it was a mistake. Deprived of this armored spearhead, the remaining units proved too weak to press the attack towards Stalingrad. Shortly before his death in the 1950s, Rouse expressed the torment his conscience still suffered for not disobeying the order and continuing the advance. There were 220,000 German soldiers and foreign auxiliaries on the Sixth Army's rosters in mid-January 1943, 2 weeks before the garrison surrendered. 6,000 survived Soviet captivity. The Battle of Stalingrad not only proved a crushing military defeat for Germany, but for her civilization became the psychological turning point of the war. In 1948, former Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller summarized the dissonance in the Fuhrer's headquarters. Many older officers of high rank sabotaged Hitler's plans. Although I'm no military expert, I know that Hitler was right about military matters more often than these people. Hitler would issue an order, and because some general would find Hitler personally offensive, this officer would indirectly disobey the order. Then, when a disaster occurred, the same man and his friends dumped the blame on Hitler, and they often lied right to his face. Believing Army Group South to be substantially weakened, the Soviets exploited their victory by opening an immediate offensive. The Germans rallied and inflicted a serious and surprising defeat on the Red Army at Kharkov in March 1943, stabilizing the German front. During late spring, the OKW began concentrating its best divisions for a new offensive with limited objectives. 2 mechanized army groups were deployed around Belgorod and Orel to launch a pincer movement to destroy a Soviet concentration near Kursk. Hitler confided to General Guderian that the proposed Operation Citadel made him sick to his stomach, though some of his best military strategists supported this unimaginative plan. The OKW hoped to restore Germany's prestige in the eyes of her allies as well as morale in the armed forces with a major victory. It also anticipated netting several 100,000 prisoners who could be integrated into Germany's industrial workforce. Citadel began on July 5, 1943. Passages quoted from the memoirs of German infantrymen in the first wave suggest that subversives in the OKH had betrayed this operation as well. Kurt Foch, a grenadier in the Leibstandarte, wrote this the first day of the attack with a huge commitment of panzers, artillery, and elite divisions. Dive bomber attacks and rocket launchers such as never before seen in warfare, and we're stuck here lying flat till Ivan shoots us to pieces. I realize with a shudder there's no element of surprise. It looks instead as though he knew how and where the German attack would take place. Herbert Bruniger, serving in the SS Totenkampf Division, recalled that the day before the offensive, the 2 deserters waving a white flag came over to us from the Pirol woods. The deserters tell us what we still don't know, the scope and exact timetable of our offensive. During the battle, Bruniger continued, I learned from one of our artillery officers that this operation was already postponed twice because the attack schedule had been betrayed. Hitler called off the slow-moving, costly advance in less than 2 weeks. The fighting at Orel, Belgorod coincided with Anglo-American landings in Italy. This compelled the OKW to transfer troops to the Mediterranean theater so that the Red Army went over to the offensive. It never relinquished the strategic initiative for the balance of the war. Traitors on the general staff continued to work for their country's defeat. General Rudolf Schmundt said this of the plotters. They stick together through thick and thin, sabotage the Führer's orders whenever they can, naturally in such a way that the evidence never points to them. They're always scattering sand in the machinery of our armed forces. Each one watches the other's back. Officers who don't belong to their clique they try to banish of some insignificant posts. In the summer of 1944, law enforcement authorities cracked the resistance movement and began trying the ringleaders for treason. One of the defendants, the former Social Democrat Wilhelm Leuschner, testified about a conversation he had once had with Ludwig Beck, a general staff officer during World War I. Beck had become chief of staff in 1935. He had retired from active service before the Second War, but the former general still intrigued against Hitler. His fellow plotters considered him the military head of the anti-government movement. Leuschner's recollection of Beck's words, quoted here, offer disturbing insight into the designs of these so-called Germans. Beck explained that there are now enough people we can depend on in positions of command on the Eastern Front, that the war can be controlled until the regime collapses. They arrange, for example, retreats of their units without ever informing neighboring formations so that the Soviets can penetrate the gap and roll up the front on both sides. These neighboring units are therefore also forced to retreat or are captured. The following illustrates what it meant to be captured by the Red Army, as Leuschner so indifferently described. In June 1944, the Soviets began a major offensive against Army Group Center. The Germans had shifted reinforcements too far south to the sector where Galen had falsely warned that an enemy operation would take place. Foreign armies east apparently took no notice of the 138 Soviet divisions and 5,200 tanks, in all 2.5 million Russian soldiers, massed opposite Army Group Center. The Army Group's first General Staff Officer, a tenanted aristocrat named Henning von Tresckow, had gradually filled the entire staff with anti-Hitler officers. The Russian attack, Army Group Center's report for the first day stated, was a complete surprise since according to the current evaluation of the enemy, no one presumed such massing of enemy forces. In the path of the Soviet juggernaut was the fully operational German Fourth Army. Much according to Beck's recipe for defeat, it received no orders, nor was it informed of the plight of neighboring formations. In the words of historian Rolf Hinz, it suffered from an inexplicable lack of direction from the headquarters of Army Group Center. Tresckow made no effort to reestablish communications or to airlift supplies. His staff dispatched not one observation plane to reconnoiter the progress of advancing enemy mechanized forces, which would have been necessary for determining a retreat route for the Fourth Army. The Germans lost a total of 350,000 men during the Soviet offensive, of which 150,000 became prisoners of war. Roughly half of these men soon died from shootings along the march to collection areas, starvation or neglect during the torturous rail journey jammed into freight cars toward the Russian interior. The Soviets paraded 57,600 survivors through Moscow. The mob lining the street cursed, threatened, and spat at the helpless prisoners. This was the fate that Tresckow, Galen, Beck, and company visited upon their countrymen who wore the same uniform. Throughout the struggle against the USSR, the German soldier fought in the Mediterranean theater as well. First engaged in Libya and in the Balkans, he eventually defended Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy against slowly advancing Allied forces. He also guarded Europe's Atlantic coast in preparation for the Anglo-Americans' long-heralded invasion, until the Allied troops that were massing in England crossed to Normandy on June 6, 1944. The German garrison in France experienced comparative tranquility. Pre-invasion France was a suitable environment for subversive staff officers to reinforce their position without distraction. They transferred abettors to the corps and divisional headquarters where the armed forces were most vulnerable and contrived to coordinate their sabotage with Western allies. The resistance liaison agent was Count Helmuth von Moltke, a wealthy landowner hoping to exterminate the National Socialist ideology. He maintained contact with Gödeler, Halder, and Beck, and told an English acquaintance in 1942 that he and his friends consider a military defeat and occupation of Germany absolutely necessary for moral and political reasons. Canaris sent Moltke to Istanbul the following year to establish contact with the Americans. There he met with two professors affiliated with the U.S. intelligence agency, the Office of Strategic Services. After the interview, the pair submitted a report to OSS Chief Bill Donovan describing the readiness of a powerful German group to prearrange and support military operations of allies against Nazi Germany. The OSS drafted the Hermann Plan, based on negotiations with Moltke, which it forwarded to the Allies' combined chiefs of staff. It stated that the German group is prepared to develop a far-reaching and military plan of cooperation as possible with the Allies, so that rapid, decisive success on a wide front is secured. Moltke's accomplices offered to fly a general staff officer to England to arrange with the Western Allies the opening of the German West Front in case of a planned invasion. U.S. records on the progress of the negotiations remain classified to this day. Washington withholds the names of German contact persons and agents who never came to light through arrest by the Gestapo, post-war admission in personal memoirs and interviews, or by accident. In October 1945, representatives of the U.S. military government in Germany and the War Department convened to discuss views on documents which should be destroyed or to which the Germans were to be denied all future access. The conference chairman, Lieutenant Colonel S. F. Groening, recommended serious consideration must be given to plans for the organization of the destruction of papers which possess no value for the Allies and which must not be permitted to fall into German hands after the departure of the occupational forces. Among the inaccessible records are those pertaining to U.S. collusion with German subversives before and during the Normandy invasion. The reader must decide whether incidents cited below, in which German command centers issued orders which were militarily incomprehensible given the tactical situation, are the product of prearranged sabotage or the example of gross misjudgment by well-trained and thoroughly experienced professional staff officers. Prior to the beginning of Operation Overlord, the Allies' code name for the invasion, the Germans possessed a communications, espionage, and reconnaissance network cables of discerning the enemy's plans well in advance. Technicians in the German Postal Investigation Office has even tapped into the Atlantic cable. In early 1944, they monitored a conversation between Churchill and Roosevelt about the approaching landings. At the same time, a specially trained SD agent parachuted into England for a captured B-17 bomber. He had been reared in the United States so that the German-born operative could convincingly pose as a British officer of engineers. Arriving in Portsmouth, he visited unit after unit, inquiring about how he could improve the troops' equipment. He supplied Berlin with detailed messages regarding invasion preparations using a radio transmitting a virtually untraceable signal. In April 1944, the U.S. 4th Division conducted a mock landing, Operation Tiger, at Slapton Sands to simulate the planned attack on Utah Beach along the Normandy coast. The German operative sent his superiors advance warning of the exercise, where a large number of ships and troops would be concentrated in broad daylight. He even transmitted the precise location of the building where U.S. General Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley intended to observe the maneuver. Though the Ninth Air Fleet of the Luftwaffe had enough bombers available to launch a surprise raid on the Allied ships as the SD agent recommended, it neglected the opportunity. On the second day of the exercise, German speedboats attacked on their own initiative, torpedoing 4 large landing ships, causing the death of hundreds of Allied troops. The question of whether the Allies would land at Calais, where the English Channel is most narrow, or further south at Normandy, supposedly tormented German intelligence. In February 1944, an Arado 240 twin-engine observation plane joined the 3rd Test Formation, an Air Force reconnaissance unit. Thanks to its exceptionally high speed, the Arado began safely flying 2 to 3 missions daily over English ports. Curiously, the Luftwaffe staff abruptly transferred it to Reconnaissance Squadron F-100 on the Eastern Front in March, depriving the Atlantic defense of this valuable spotter. Though incapable of the Arado's performance, the Messerschmitt 410 and Bf 109 combat aircraft were able to patrol the English coast during variable weather, descending from a high altitude to gain speed. The pilots identified hundreds of landing vessels assembled at Southampton and Portsmouth on April 25th. They discovered no similar concentration in the English harbors of Dover and Folkestone, which were opposite Calais. German signals personnel monitoring enemy radio traffic between Plymouth and Portsmouth established beyond any doubt that these ports were the staging zones for an invading army. Nevertheless, the General Staff took no corresponding measures, such as transferring more troops to Normandy or laying nautical mines. The Germans also employed a captured American Thunderbolt fighter to photograph the enemy ship build-up that spring. Shortly before D-Day, the Allied landings on June 6th, however, the OKW suspended all reconnaissance flights over England without explanation. At Tourcoing, headquarters of the German 15th Army, Lieutenant Colonel Helmut Meyer operated a sophisticated radio monitoring system. Its 30 specialists were each fluent in 3 languages, and they intercepted English radio traffic on June 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 5th, announcing the invasion. This discovery, Meyer sent up the chain of command, but no one alarmed the frontline units. In May 1942, Hitler had ordered the systematic construction of fortifications along the Western European coastline. In addition to large artillery emplacements reinforced by thick concrete walls, his plan called for a myriad of small steel and concrete structures. These included shallow one-man wells to conceal machine gunners, bunkers for anti-tank or anti-aircraft guns, protected storage for munitions, and shelters for personnel. The building of this Atlantic wall defending the beaches of Calais, Normandy, and Brittany consumed immense quantities of cement and iron and employed thousands of artisans and laborers. In May 1943 alone, 260,000 men were at work on the project. Defending the coast was Army Group B, consisting of the German 7th and 15th Armies. The commander of the Army Group, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, believed that the invasion should be repulsed right on the beaches. Were the invaders to penetrate inland, the German army would succumb to their quantitative superiority and control of the skies. The basic plan was that once the enemy landed, the coastal artillery and frontline infantry divisions would keep him pinned down until German armored formations could counterattack. The Allies intended to land 20,000 men in the first wave and have 107,000 ashore by the second night of the invasion. The German Seventh Army, which would bear the brunt at Normandy, was 128,358 men strong. Many were veterans of earlier campaigns, occupying numerous fortified, well-concealed positions constructed of solid building materials. The 91st Airborne Division comprised another 10,555 men, supplemented this force. The OKW subordinated the 4,500-man Parachute Rifle Regiment 6 to the 91st. This was a superbly trained and resolutely led formation, especially suitable for combating Allied paratroopers. Supporting the 7th Army were 3 armored divisions comprising 56,150 men, and the Germans had 3 more panzer divisions in western France. By all estimates, the defenders, even considered Allied air power, had sufficient forces on hand to repel the invasion. In fact, the American Chief of Staff General Walter Bedell Smith estimated that there was a 50% chance the Allies would be unable to hold the Normandy beachhead. During the final weeks before D-Day, German staff officers neglected opportunities to strengthen the Atlantic Wall and arranged troop and supply movements that substantially weakened its defensive capabilities. One German surveillance unit infiltrated French resistance cells with 35 of its operatives. They furnished Colonel Oscar Rail, the unit's commander, with a list of lines of communication, power stations, rail and traffic junctions, and fuel depots the French planned to sabotage once the invasion was underway. They also revealed the location of where partisans intended to ambush German troops en route to the combat zone. Rail delivered a comprehensive written report to General Heinrich Stuppnagel, the military commander in France. The report included the pre-arranged sentences the BBC would broadcast to alert the French resistance that the invasion fleet is at the sea. Stuppnagel, however, was secretly attempting to win the cooperation of this communist-oriented terrorist organization for the coup against Hitler. He took no action on Rail's information. Rommel employed the OKW to release several million French-made Teller mines in storage since the 1940 campaign. He wished to incorporate them into the network of wire obstacles along the beaches. After months of stalling, the OKW delivered them a couple days before the invasion, too late to emplace. The Germans' own coastal mines, equipped with both magnetic and pressure detonators and difficult to disarm, had been in production since 1943. Some 2,000 of these powerful explosive devices had been stowed in an underground airplane hangar at Le Mans. But instead of using them to mine coastal waters, supply personnel received orders to transfer the mines to Magdeburg, Germany, as a precaution against sabotage. On May 15, 1944, the German High Command transferred the second group of Fighter Squadron 26 from Normandy to Mont-de-Marsan in southern France. Only days before the invasion, it also relocated elements of Fighter Squadron 2 to airfields around Paris. The Luftwaffe still possessed 183 FW-190 daylight fighters and camouflage bases near the coast, but on June 4, 26, Squadron Commander Joseph Priller received orders to fly another 124 fighters to Mont-de-Marsan in southern France, far from Normandy. Ground personnel and ordnance would travel there by truck, hence temporarily neutralizing the squadron's combat effectiveness. Priller telephoned General Werner Junk, chief of the 2nd Fighter Corps, and protested, "This is just pure insanity. If we're expecting an invasion, the squadrons have to be here, not gone away somewhere. And what happens if the attack takes place right during the move? Are you all nuts?" Junk brusquely replied that his irate subordinate cannot judge important developments of state from the perspective of a squadron commander. On the morning of June 6, Colonel Priller and his wingman, Sergeant Heinz Wodarczyk, strafed the first wave of the Allied landing forces. 2 FW-190s were all that the Luftwaffe could scramble after years to prepare a defense. Frequent Anglo-American bombing raids on German cities forced the Luftwaffe to deploy fighter squadrons to defend the Reich's airspace. Weeks before the invasion, an operations staff prepared additional airfields in western France to rapidly transfer the planes to combat Allied landing forces. The plan called for temporarily shifting 600 fighters. Transport personnel then received orders to collect a portion of the fuel, munitions, and spare parts stockpiled at the provisional French air bases and move them back into Germany. As a result, only 200 planes could relocate to these runways, followed by another 100 on June 20th. The plan initially envisioned the further transfer of most of Germany's night fighters. Their experienced pilots could have taken a deadly toll of the slow-flying Douglas transport planes ferrying Allied airborne troops to drop zones, and the British four-engine Lancaster bombers towing gliders hours before the amphibious landings began. Instead, the Luftwaffe operations staff ordered the night fighters to assemble in airspace well east of the coast, far from the drop zones. Post-war historians explain that Allied radio interference and ruses, including aircraft dropping strips of tinfoil to confound German radar, confused the enemy during the crucial phase. This, however, is a dubious explanation for the fighters' misdirection on the night of June 5th and 6th. Well before D-Day, the experienced German officers who directed nocturnal missions had been successfully guiding their aircraft to intercept RAF bombers, despite ongoing similar British efforts to disrupt them. In April and May, Luftwaffe bombers flew nighttime missions against Portsmouth and Plymouth. A raid by 101 medium bombers on the night of April 30th caused considerable damage to Plymouth's harbor installations. But on May 30th, with the invasion armada congested and taking on troops and supplies, the Luftwaffe discontinued the missions. The Germans concentrated a substantial amount of artillery on the Atlantic Wall, whose crews conducted frequent firing exercises. Many batteries rested in massive concrete bunkers that could withstand repeated hits from naval or aerial bombardment. Observation posts and rangefinders were in reinforced emplacements to direct the fire. However, 10 days before D-Day, orders came to move over half the artillery ammunition into storage in St. Louis, and the crews of the observation bunkers received instructions to dismount all rangefinders for immediate shipment to Paris for inspection. On June 6th, German coastal gunners had to fire on Allied warships by sighting down the barrel. Once the invasion began, the gun crews received deliveries of ammunition from the St. Louis arsenal. Projectiles were often of the wrong caliber. One 88mm battery was issued a load of special rounds for spiking the barrels. One of the worst disadvantages for the defenders was the absence of senior officers the morning of June 6. The day before, the commander of the 7th Army, General Friedrich Dollmann, had ordered all divisional, regimental, and artillery chiefs to Rennes to take part in war games. He also personally postponed an alarm exercise for his army scheduled for the night of June 5th to 6th. Had the drill run its course, the troops would have been on full alert when the invaders came. Other commanders were on inspection tours, hunting, or visiting Paris nightclubs. Even Rommel was away. His chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, was an active conspirator who had encouraged Rommel to return to Germany for a family birthday party. Among the few generals to remain at his post was Dietrich Kreis, who kept his 352nd Infantry Division on alert of his own initiative. Defending bloody Omaha Beach, his men inflicted serious losses on the first wave of U.S. troops. The trump card of the German defense scenario was armor. During 1943, the Waffen-SS established two new tank divisions, the 9th Hohenstaufen and 10th Frundsberg. Formed into the 2nd SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser, their mission was to help repulse an invasion in the West, and their training emphasized countermeasures against airborne and nautical landings, with enemy air superiority. In March 1944, despite Hitler's misgivings, the OKW transferred the corps to the southern Ukraine to rescue General Valentin Hube's surrounded 1st Panzer Army. Hauser's division accomplished the task, but the Supreme Command kept them in the Ukraine as an army reserve. The OKW shifted the corps from sector to sector, performing no useful purpose and disrupting training. Corporal Franz Widman recalled, "Then comes the report from the Western Front on June 6 that the Allies have landed in Normandy. We, the Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg, who had drilled and prepared for this landing for months, sat around in Russia doing nothing and waited for the Russians to attack." Finally, on June 12th, Hauser received orders to return with his corps to France. The fatiguing rail journey across Europe ended over 150 miles from the invasion front. Since the June nights were short, much of the road march west took place in daylight. This not only exposed the vehicles to attack by enemy fighter bombers, but the inordinate driving distance reduced engine life of the tracked vehicles by half. The Army's most formidable formation was the Panzer-Lehr Division. Its 229 fully operational tanks included upgraded Panzer IVs and high-performance Panthers. The divisions had 658 armored half-tracks serving as personnel carriers or mounting anti-aircraft guns, rocket launchers, flamethrowers, and cannons. The OKW stationed this mechanized monolith nearly 100 miles from the Normandy coast. On June 4th, the High Command ordered the division to load its Panther tanks on a freight train for transfer to Russia. They were en route east when the invasion began. Taking away the Panther Battalion robbed the division of its strongest attack force, wrote its last commanding officer after the war. The U.S. Army later calculated that it averaged a loss of 5 Sherman tanks to neutralize a single Panther in combat. Shortly before 10 p.m. on the evening of June 5, 1944, naval personnel manning the German radar station at Pineboeuf, near Saint-Nazaire, discovered a large concentration of ships making south from England. Radio operator Gerhard Junger recalled, "It was clear to every one of us that the long-awaited invasion had begun." The radar stations at Le Havre and Cherbourg also monitored the Allied Armada, reporting its movement to the staff of the Commander-in-Chief West, Gerd von Rundstedt, in Paris. They further intercepted American meteorological predictions transmitted to the U.S. bomber squadrons, which normally did not fly nocturnal missions. At 3:09 a.m. on June 6, the Navy reported hundreds of ships course south to the Supreme Command West. The Luftwaffe Signals Company of the Isle of Guernsey of the Normandy coast identified 180 Lancaster bombers towing gliders toward the mainland at 10:40 p.m. The commander of a German army regiment on the island was duly notified and relayed the information to an adjutant at his corps headquarters in St. Lo. Having hosted guests that evening at Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, Speidel received word from General Erich Mark's Army Corps of Allied airborne landings in 5 different areas, another report from the Navy Group West of paratroopers dropping in sectors defending by the German 716th and 711th Infantry Divisions, confirming from Major Forster about the situation developing near the 711th, and a Luftwaffe report that 50 to 60 transport machines were ferrying in enemy paratroops. Speidel did not alarm his divisions. When Rundstedt's staff telephoned Speidel for clarification, he replied that the reports are considered exaggerations. Army Group B headquarters wrote them off as possibly confused with flight crews bailing out. The commander of the 716th Infantry Division, General Wilhelm Richter, wrote that there was no alert until Allied paratroopers were already in action. The Chief of Staff of OB West, Gunther Blumentritt, justified not sounding the alarm to avoid unnecessarily disturbing the troops who need time to sleep. Once the landings were underway, Rundstedt formally requested immediate release of the 3 armored divisions in Normandy from the OKW Reserve for deployment at the front. From Hitler's headquarters, General Alfred Jodl refused, explaining, "According to the reports I've received, this attack can only be a feint. I don't think now is the time to release the OKW reserves." In Rommel's absence, Speidel had persuaded the Führer's headquarters by telephone that until the situation becomes clarified, the OKW has to keep its nerve and wait. Rundstedt's chief of operations, Colonel Bato Zimmermann, telephoned the OKW to produce senseless delay. The OKW's Baron Horst von Butler Brandefels, another general conspired against the government, shouted in reply, "You have no right without our prior permission to alarm the armored troops. You are to halt the panzers at once." The OKW posted the weakest of the 3 reserve armored divisions, the 21st closest to the coast, despite the urgings of its commanding officer to authorize an attack against British paratroopers who had landed nearby. Speidel denied permission at 4:30 a.m. to commit the division's panzer regiment. The formation remained concealed in a wooded area for hours. Finally released by the 7th Army to attack the drop zone, Panzer Regiment 22 began rolling at 8 a.m. Speidel soon directed it to about face and advance toward the coast, keeping the troops on the road and out of action for much of the day. The 21st suffered repeated aerial attacks and lost 50 tanks on the march. It ultimately attacked on direct orders from Rommel, who had just returned from Normandy. Speidel had briefed his commander-in-chief on the situation in a telephone conversation at 10:15 a.m. The marshal's arrival late that evening put an end to his chief of staff's dilatory tactics. Speidel had, however, effectively sabotaged the timely deployment of 3 armored divisions. During midday on June 6, he also refused requests by General Max Pemsel to reinforce the hard-pressed 716th Infantry Division, defending the east bank of the Orne River with the elements of a neighboring formation. The division was practically wiped out by nightfall. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, was alerted by its commanding officer at 2:30 a.m. and by the OB West at 4. On his own initiative, Speidel sent the division in the wrong direction. In position near Lisieux, it received his instructions to transfer 30 miles further from the coast. The order had a shocking effect on the troops, wrote its first general staff officer, Hubert Meyer, after the war. A new directive arrived from the division to about face and advance toward Caen late in the afternoon. That meant a change of direction, more time lost, and for our strung-out armored unit, one more day's march under rotten conditions, recalled the Panther crewman George Gestat. We had the impression that the whole movement of our army's components was like an anthill someone had struck with a stick. Gestat reflected on the corresponding influence on morale. Disappointment, even anger, spread among the men. Almost every soldier saw that something here just isn't right. Heinz Schmolke, a company commander in the division's Panzer Grenadier Regiment 26, wrote later, "The troops and frontline officers of all ranks knew back then that the enemy had to be driven back into the sea in his moment of weakness. That is during the first hours after the landings. My regiment only went into action on the third day of the invasion, although we could have engaged the enemy within the first 3 hours." The modus operandi of various army staffers was to keep the troops on the road as long as possible, often exposing the men to strikes by Allied aircraft. As columns of the Panzer Lehr Division approached Caen, according to a surviving officer, they were discovered by enemy aerial reconnaissance and a short time later attacked with machine guns, rockets, and bombs. Soon, black pillars of smoke from the burning vehicles revealed the route for fresh waves of fighter bombers. Even today, many years later, recalling this march caused nightmares for everyone who participated. The division lost 10% of its strength before reaching the combat zone. Despite the protests of its commanding officer, Fritz Berlin, Dolman had ordered the Panzer Lehr Division to advance on Caen at 5 p.m. in broad daylight, after having withheld its marching orders for 9 hours. Simultaneously traveling to the coast was the non-motorized 277th Infantry Division. General Dolman, aware of the good progress it was making by rail from southern France, ordered it to detrain in Angers and proceed on foot. A 14-day march to Normandy, the 277th commanding officer, General Albert Praun, drove ahead to Dolman's headquarters in Le Mans to have the order rescinded. There, Praun observed the staff's female telephone operators dressed in swimsuits, sunbathing in hammocks and on the roof of the bunker. In a meticulously researched post-war study of the German defense at Normandy, Ewald Klaptor, a former Waffen-SS captain who had participated in the fighting, concluded that the Army Group B displayed no particular hurry in shifting divisions to the combat zone. On D-Day, Rommel ordered the transfer to Normandy of the fully motorized 3 Flak Corps, quartered southern of Amiens, but the Corps commander, General Wolfgang Pickert, only learned of the invasion well into the afternoon. He first had to drive to Paris to get confirmation. His batteries, which were also effective against armor, did not reach the front until June 8th and 9th. Even arriving late, the Corps shot down 462 aircraft and destroyed over 100 Allied tanks. One staff officer who played a primary role in thwarting German countermeasures at Normandy was Colonel Alexis Freier von Rohen. As chief of Foreign Armies West and protege of Gehlen, he sought to deceive Hitler, Rommel, and Rundstedt through bogus reports that the Normandy operation was a feint intended to divert German formations from Calais, farther to the north where the real invasion was supposedly about to take place. General Eisenhower had hoped to mislead the defenders through Operation Fortitude, consisting of false reports about a fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, waiting in reserve in England to launch an invasion at Calais. Rowan came by this information as the Allies had intended. He forwarded it to the OKW, but not before drastically inflating the number of American divisions beyond that which U.S. intelligence had fabricated on June 2nd. Receiving Rowan's analysis, Speidel's staff actually increased the tally farther. The assessments regarding the Allies' dispositions and plans that Rowan supplied to Army Group B were too consistently inaccurate to have been unintentional. Evidence of surveillance refuting Rowan's mendacious predictions never reached the Fuhrer. At dawn on June 6, Lieutenant Aldebert Barwolf flew a Messerschmitt Bf 109 Model G8 observation plane over the Allied invasion fleet. The photographs he took of the enormous armada off the Normandy coast should have dispelled any doubt that this was the only landing force. The General Staff of Army Group B took no action, nor did it forward the images up the chain of command. Speidel used the specter of a landing at Calais to prevent the transfer to Normandy of combat-ready reserves from the German 15th Army in position on the northern flank of the 7th. This formation was 1.5 times the size of the 7th Army and included the 2nd and 116th Panzer Divisions. The later was among the best equipped in the German armed forces. More importantly, the 15th Army had 30 times the transport capacity available to Dolman's divisions at Normandy, even though it had shorter supply lines and was not in action. Speidel repeatedly refused to transfer any of these vehicles to support combat operations, explaining to dismayed field commanders on June 22nd, for example, that according to all reports at hand, an attack against the Channel front on both sides of the Somme at Calais is still expected. Speidel ordered the 116th Panzer Division transferred toward Dieppe, away from the fighting on June 6th. One report at hand that Speidel forgot to mention was the capture on the afternoon of June 7th of Allied operational plans for the U.S. Army's 5th and 6th Corps and for the British 30th Corps, supporting a counterattack by the Engineer Battalion of the German 352nd Infantry Division and Grenadier Regiment 916. Cossacks of the 493rd East Battalion discovered the documents among the bodies of U.S. naval officers in an abandoned landing craft. Over 100 pages long, the cache revealed that the Normandy operation would be the only invasion. Lieutenant Colonel Fritz Ziegelmann of the 352nd delivered the find to his superiors. The headquarters of the 7th Army did not act on this valuable intelligence coup. Staff officers transplanted from the Eastern Front caused terrible consequences for the German defense at Normandy. In May 1944, General Wagner, remiss in shipping cold weather gear to the troops in 1941, attempted to transfer the entire stockpile of artillery rounds for the 352nd and 716th Infantry Divisions to an Army ammunition depot far behind the lines. This was supposedly to increase the amount of munitions in reserve. Only the intervention of General Marx prevented Wagner from carrying out this suspicious directive, which would have practically crippled the two divisions on D-Day. Wagner appointed Colonel Fink, who had previously mismanaged supply deliveries to Stalingrad, to quartermaster for Rommel's army in June 1944. Almost immediately, deliveries to the front of fuel and munitions slowed down drastically. The German method of employing French waterways at night to convey material remained successful and undetected by the Allies until Fink interfered. Under his direction, just 1/10 of the artillery's allotted ammunition was coming forward, despite sufficient stores in the depots. The troops were receiving only 1/5 of the required quantity of other supplies. On July 2nd, General Alfred Gauss reported from Caen that only 3 to 5 rounds per gun were available to German batteries per day. Rommel assigned General Friedrich Dimm to investigate the bottleneck. Dimm advised Rommel of Fink's dereliction of duty. The field marshal wanted Fink court-martialed. Among the suppliers that never reached the front, subsequently falling into U.S. hands, were 500,000 gallons of aviation fuel, 175,000 days' rations for troops, including 2.5 million cigarettes. What German soldiers did receive was often useless. At Carentan, for example, transport planes airdropped provisions to Parachute Rifle Regiment 6. The German paratroopers, low on small arms ammunition, found some containers filled with condoms. Hitler believed that treason played a decisive role in the success of the Allied landings. Regarding the German defense of Cherbourg, Rochus Misch of the Führer's staff recalled, "Pictures reach us from Sweden showing a German colonel in command of a bunker installation defending the invasion coast, toasting 2 English officers with champagne, naturally without having fired a single shot. Nothing, absolutely nothing, worked right on the German side during the invasion. There was but one explanation: betrayal and sabotage." In his memoirs, Corporal Otto Henning of the Panzer Division attributes the fall of Cherbourg to unknown individuals in the Führer's headquarters, who stalled the transfer of fully equipped reserves to Normandy while the 7th Army bled. The eyewitness Henning's verdict: "One can't avoid the impression that here the most varied orders were intentionally twisted, while other equally important orders were simply never forwarded." Gestapo Chief Müller, perhaps the best informed man in Germany with respect to sabotage, said after the war, "A great measure of the German military's wretched performance in France after the invasion was the result of attempts by the conspirators and their friends to surrender to the Western powers or to let the Americans and English pass right through our front line so that they would reach Germany before the Russians did." German headquarters staffers failed to alarm frontline units, air crews, and naval forces in a timely manner. They delayed counterattacks, issued frequently conflicting orders, and commanded anti-aircraft batteries to hold their fire during the Allied aerial bombardment of the Le Havre naval base. They transferred combat-ready formations away from the enemy and plotted against their own government. Speidel, who in Rommel's initial absence directed Army Group B during the critical first stage of the invasion, spent much of the morning on June 6th playing table tennis with fellow staff officers. It is inconceivable that the German army in France, major component of an experienced combat force accustomed to fighting at unfavorable odds, could function in such chaotic fashion after months of preparation and rehearsal for a crucial battle. In January 1944, by comparison, withdrawing German troops in Italy occupied the Gustav Line south of Rome. Their engineers had been fortifying it the previous October. Despite being outnumbered in some sectors by Allied forces 10-1, with virtually no armor or air support, the German defenders held their position for 4 months. At Cassino, the key position on the Gustav Line, a New Zealand division spent 4 days trying to neutralize a single German panzer concealed in the ruins, suffering nearly 300 men killed. The Germans at Normandy possessed hundreds of panzers and stronger, more systematically prepared defenses, yet forfeited the initiative on the first day of combat. So surreptitious was the German resistance movement, its ruinous influence may never have come to light but for a single incident. A bungled attempt to assassinate Hitler on July 20, 1944, prompted an ongoing state investigation. This exposed the conspiracy to sabotage the German war effort. It led to the death by firing squad, suicide, or execution after trial of 160 plotters. The would-be assassin was Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army since July 1, 1944. There were approximately 500,000 soldiers trained and fully equipped, awaiting transfer to the front. In charge of the Reserve Army was General Friedrich Fromm. To weaken the field formations, he contrived ways to delay the deployment of the Ersetz troops under his administration. During the first month of fighting in Normandy, for example, the Germans suffered 96,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Under Fromm's direction, the Western Army received just 6,000 replacements and 17 new tanks. In July, battalions stationed in Holland for the purpose of replacing losses to infantry divisions fighting in Normandy were transferred to southern France instead. Stauffenberg represented Fromm at the Führer's headquarters in Rastenburg during situation conferences. His job was to report on the progress of replenishing the combat divisions with reserve personnel. Stauffenberg understood his mission as the fabrication of plausible excuses for why only a fraction of the troops languishing in homeland garrisons were moving forward. An officer on Goebbels' staff summarized the deception explanation Stauffenberg offered Hitler. The air raids are responsible, he says. Then only the gas masks are lacking. Next, the NCOs still have some mandatory course, or a particular type of ammunition isn't available, or rather can't be delivered because of the destroyed transportation network. An arsenal suffered a direct hit where the rifle bolts for a whole regiment were stored. Always at the last minute, something gets in their way. Stauffenberg once told fellow plotters that their allies were Germany's military crises and defeats. Stauffenberg concealed in his briefcase a time bomb, weapon of choice for terrorists worldwide, and smuggled it into the July 20th conference at Rastenburg. He prudently left the session before the explosion and boarded a courier plane for Berlin. The blast superficially injured Hitler, but mortally wounded his stenographer and 3 officers. Several others among the 24 participants suffered injuries. Among those to die was Rudolf Schmundt, who had recently used his personal influence with the Führer to promote Stauffenberg's lackluster career. Another victim was the staff officer Colonel Heinz Brandt, an opponent of National Socialism, whom no one had forewarned of the day's agenda. At the OKW offices on Bendler Street in Berlin, accomplices awaited news of Hitler's demise to launch the Valkyrie, the coup to overthrow the National Socialist government. There, among others, were the pensioned General Ludwig Beck, ex-General Erich Hoepner, who had been dishonorably discharged from the army in 1942 for insubordination and cowardice, the retired Field Marshal Erwin von Witzbuch, and General Friedrich Olbricht, who was Fromm's subordinate based on the examination of captured German goods. The U.S. State Department later established Olbricht had leaked military secrets to the Red Orchestra via Josevius. When Stauffenberg arrived, he told the colleagues that the commander-in-chief did not survive the bombing. The plotters therefore set the revolt in motion. Back at Rastenburg, General Felgebel, who was privy to the planned assassination, did not contact the Berlin conspirators to warn them of its failure. Instead, he was among the first to congratulate Hitler on his narrow escape from death. Felgebel was able to briefly block communications between Rastenburg and the outside world, but could not indefinitely disrupt telephone service. Hitler reached Goebbels in the capital. He also spoke on the line with Major Ernst Remmer, commander of the Berlin Watch Regiment. He ordered Remmer to arrest the conspirators. One reason for the coup's rapid collapse was the lack of cooperation the usurpers received from the army. Signals personnel on the Bendler block monitored the Führer's telephone conversation. Aware of the circumstances, they did not transmit teletype orders formulated by the plotters to military units. Colonel Fritz Jaeger, a member of Stauffenberg's circle, visited several barracks to muster a company of riflemen to seize the radio station, the propaganda ministry, and to arrest Goebbels. He could not find a single soldier willing to carry out his orders. Stupping-Nagel and a handful of like-minded aristocrats supported the coup from their Paris headquarters. They managed to mobilize a battalion of German Security Regiment No. 1 to arrest members of the SD and the Gestapo, including the SS police chief in Paris, Karl Oberg. In their office, Stuppnagel associates persuaded the battalion's troops that the SD had rebelled against Hitler. Only through this fiction did they gain the men's cooperation. In Berlin, one of the teletype orders Witzelblum drafted for the army falsely blamed an unscrupulous clique of party leaders who are nowhere near the front for the mutiny he himself helped instigate. According to an analysis by a contemporary German historian, the plotters did not risk openly confessing that the coup was directed against Hitler, but argued instead to be acting supposedly in the name of the dead Führer against an unscrupulous clique. They were themselves not certain in their own cause. They feared that most of the armed forces and the German people stood behind Hitler in their hearts and would therefore not obey them. Military members of the resistance movement had no connection with the rank and file of the armed forces. They have nothing within them in common with the German soldier, charged the Völkischer Beobachter on July 22nd. Stauffenberg, for example, had never held a combat command. His army driver, Karl Schweitzer, testified later that the Count had maintained a generous supply of wine, champagne, schnapps, liquors, and tobacco at both his Berlin residence and his duty office in the War Ministry. Lieutenant Colonel Fritz von der Lancken had regularly procured luxury items, unavailable to the frontline soldier or to the German public in the fifth year of the war, for his fellow conspirator. Schweitzer stated that he could scarcely remember a day when Stauffenberg did not consume alcohol. The Count had also arranged for frequent deliveries to his home address of smoked eel, oil sardines, and other delicacies through administrative contacts with North Sea fisheries. The chief of the SD, Dr. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, prepared a series of confidential reports for the Reichschancellery analyzing the motives of the plotters. After the war, the former resistance member Friedrich Georgi judged the reports to be absolutely sober and factual, if not, of course, one-sided. Regarding Stauffenberg, Kaltenbrunner concluded in his September 23, 1944 report that the Count and his circle of aristocrats pursued not only political objectives but social ones, namely to reinstate and maintain the privileged position of a select socially connected groups of persons. Major Remmer wrote of July 20th, "The presumed death of Adolf Hitler left all the officers and also the troops in a state of shock. Never in my life, even after the collapse in 1945, have I witnessed such profound sorrow." In his post-war autobiography, Gunther Adam, a veteran of the SS Hohenstaufen division which was deployed in France that July, included his own recollection. That evening, after a day of combat, some young army officers come to us in our command posts and tell us that there was an attempt on the life of the Führer that had failed. They said that senior army commanders had been involved. They ask in complete sincerity if they can join us, since they are too ashamed now to be officers of the army. In the opinion of Rolf Hinz, a veteran of the 19th Panzer Division, the assassination attempt came at the most unfavorable time imaginable, at a time when unified, firm leadership was essential. The troops felt this way regardless of their diverse ideological viewpoints, even among those who inwardly rejected Hitler. Everywhere we heard the expression "stab in the back," and we were relieved that the Führer's central authority remained intact. The Führer's adjutant, Colonel Nicholas von Below, stated, "Inasmuch as the senior generals had lost that unswerving confidence in Hitler in the same measure the ordinary soldier trusted in his leadership, I have no doubt that only this fact held the front together." Right after the assassination attempt, signals personnel at Rastenburg discovered Felgebel's secret telephone line to Switzerland that had served to communicate military intelligence to Soviet agents. The Gestapo questioned staff officers, some of whom were already on the watch list, making arrests when suspicion of subversive activity surfaced. Colonel Bellow told the Führer of word received from his cousin. Since the roundup began, his Army Corps on the Eastern Front was finally receiving supplies at consistent and timely intervals. Discovery of the sabotage totally depressed Hitler, Goebbels told an associate. The Fuhrer's personal security officer, Hans Rottenhuber, said this to Geisler. The betrayal of the fighting front hit him harder than the attempt on his life. He just repeated to us that he has long reckoned with being shot at by someone in this reactionary clique, but something this underhanded he never would have expected from an officer, certainly not this shabby betrayal of the soldier who risks his life every day for Germany. In the past, Hitler had not acted on warnings from NSDAP subordinates about the General Staff's disloyalty. A military liaison officer in the propaganda ministry, Colonel Hans Wartmeyer, recalled that Goebbels claimed to possess a great amount of irrefutable evidence that a defeatist attitude among many officers of the OKW, especially in the OKH, is assuming serious proportions. The Fuhrer nonetheless shielded them from attacks by Goebbels and Himmler. The officers had sworn an oath of fealty to him, and he firmly believed in their code of loyalty and honor, wrote another Goebbels aide, Wilfried von Oven. Addressing the Rastenburg staff on July 24th, Jodl told how whenever suspicions had surfaced about particular officers, Hitler had laughed it off good-naturedly, as with the case of General Feldgebau, who had already brought attention to himself through some of his remarks. The Fuhrer expressed bitterness over the affairs to his staff. I took over the old officer corps just as it was, preserved its traditions and respected them, he said. I advanced the officers' careers and their economic status whenever I could. I recognized their achievements and rewarded them. I promoted and decorated them. Each of them who reported to me, I shook hands with them as a comrade. And now every officer up to general who comes to me, I have to search in a vestibule first, in case he's bringing in some killing device like this Count Stauffenberg, who had nothing better to do than sneak a bomb under my conference table to rid the world of me and his own comrades. The German public reacted to the news of the assassination attempt with horror and loathing, the former Gauleiter Rudolf Jordan recorded in his autobiography. In the evening, I addressed the population outdoors in the Cathedral Square in Magdeburg. The whole town took part in the demonstration of loyalty with deep emotion. It seemed to me that in view of the fateful life-or-death situation of the war, the people stood behind Adolf Hitler as one. The Lutheran Bishop of Hanover, who was personally unsympathetic to National Socialism, publicly condemned Stauffenberg's criminal scheme. At Karlshof Hospital, Hitler visited officers who had been seriously injured in the July 20th bombing. He offered General Karl Bodenschatz an analysis of the murder plot. I know that Stauffenberg, Godler, and Witzelben that thought my death to rescue the German nation, but these people really had no fixed plan of what to do next. They had no idea which army would support their coup, which military district would help them. First of all, they had not established contact with the enemy. I've even found out that the enemy refused their offer to negotiate. Hitler's information was accurate. In April 1941, the Reich's Foreign Office assigned Hans Boer to manage France's Hachette publishing house. In late 1942, the Berlin police chief, Count Heinrich Helldorf, and a general staff officer, Count Heinrich Dohna-Tolksdorf, brought him into Stubnagel's circle. Boer met with Allied representatives during a trip ban in Portugal. Contact with the Allies turned out badly, he wrote later. In the summer of 1940, the Churchill cabinet had adopted the policy of absolute silence toward the German resistance. Even before the war, the British Foreign Office had cautioned against such an alliance. In November 1938, Undersecretary Sargent had warned in a memo, an open and capable military dictatorship could even be more dangerous than the NS regime. The subversives encountered another obstacle with respect to the United States. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, Roosevelt publicly announced that the Allies will accept nothing less than the Reich's unconditional surrender. What this portended for Germany, FDR's private notes from December 1944 reveal. Whatever measures may be taken against Japan and Germany, they must in any case include the reduction of their industrial output to prevent them from competing on the world market against the English, French, Dutch, Belgians, and other exporters, and against us as well. U.S. General Albert Weidemeyer wrote, the Western Allies made not the slightest attempt to divide the Germans by promising the enemies of the Hitler regime acceptable peace terms. The Allies' attitude was no secret to members of the resistance movement. Count Ulrich Schwerin von Schwalenfeld, a staff officer and determined advocate of Hitler's murder, continued his intrigues even though acknowledging that FDR will not mollify surrender conditions. Just 2 days before Stauffenberg bombed Hitler's Situation Conference, the conspirator Otto John returned from fruitless negotiations with Allied representatives in Madrid. He informed his fellow plotters that even were the Fuhrer dead, unconditional surrender is still in force. He ultimately acknowledged that the internal German resistance against Hitler was no longer a factor of significance for the political and military strategy of the Western powers, in contrast to the resistance in France, which was nurtured by the Western powers morally and with all kinds of material. The staff officer Treschke, who described Hitler as a mad dog that has to be put down, also realized that the demise of his commander-in-chief would have no influence on the Allies' war effort. Dr. Eugen Gerstenmaier, a former conspirator and president of the West German parliament after the war, stated in a 1975 interview, "What we in the German resistance during the war didn't really want to see, we learned in full measure afterward, that this war was ultimately not waged against Hitler, but against Germany." Right after Stauffenberg's botched assassination attempt, British radio stations for Europe broadcast the name of Germans known to the English to be conspiring against Hitler. This enabled the Gestapo to round up the subversives more quickly. A BBC editorial dismissed the coup as a product of Prussia's military caste, a stratum which the Anglo-Saxons are waging war to eradicate. The German people, the BBC continued, would be deceiving themselves to entrust their leadership to such people. Fritz Hess, a specialist on English affairs in the German Foreign Office, monitored the Allied reaction and ventured, "Not much further, and the English and American radios would have congratulated Hitler on his survival." The Führer, shocked at the hostility manifest in some Allied news coverage, remarked to Ribbentrop, "These people hate Germany even more than they do me." On July 25th, John Wheeler Bennett, a British historian assisted the Foreign Office in London, submitted a memorandum on the consequences of the recent events at Rastenburg. It may now be said with some definiteness that we are better off with things as they are than if the plot of July 20 had succeeded and Hitler had been assassinated. The Gestapo and the SS have done us an appreciable service in removing a selection of those who would undoubtedly oppose as good Germans after the war. It is to our advantage, therefore, that the purge should continue, since the killing of Germans by Germans will save us from the future embarrassments of many kinds. Churchill, Eden, and the Foreign Office staff accepted Wheeler Bennett's viewpoint. An in-house analysis prepared by the OSS also regarded Hitler's escape as a blessing, explaining that it robbed the conspiring German generals of the opportunity to dump the blame for losing the war on him alone. One German general who clearly understood the Allies' outlook was Walter von Brauchig, commander of the army until December 1941. In April 1940, Halder had presented him with a written proposal to overthrow Hitler and reach a settlement with the West. Brauchig rebuked him with the words, "What's going on here is pure treason. In wartime, this is unthinkable for a soldier. This battle isn't about governments anyway, but a battle of diametrical ways of life, so getting rid of Hitler will serve no purpose." In July 1944, the Armed Forces Journal, the officers of the Führer, published an essay by Walter Gross of the Racial Policy Office. It presented the usual arguments that bloodlines contributes more to a person's intrinsic characteristics and qualities of leadership than academic and material circumstances. With respect to the military, Gross added this, "On the Führer's orders, the officer's career became open to every German man without consideration of social origin and education. Some expressed misgivings. They saw this as the intrusion of a radical socialist principle, and a danger to the accomplishments and bearing of the officer corps. Dozens of times I've encountered objections to this National Socialist innovation, objections from those who point to the lofty inherent value of a leadership class cultivated over generations of selecting the best from soldiers and officers' families. Gross parried this protest with the observation that any traditional exclusive system stifles the development of unexplored human resources within the nation. Beyond such socially elevated families, there also rest within a people thousands upon thousands of individuals of comparable aptitude submerged in the broad masses. They possess the same value to the community and are capable of accomplishing just as much in a particular field as the best of the old cultivated families. Wherever people with similar and equally precious qualities lie undiscovered, then it is possible and indeed necessary to find them and place them in communal life. With the right training, they can achieve the utmost they're capable of. The standard for determining whether the inherent prerequisites are present or are lacking is one and the same for both groups. It lies exclusively in accomplishing the task at hand. When Hitler reinstated national defense before the war, the men occupying positions of command had entered service during the time of the old army. Many senior officers displayed little imagination or adaptability to warfare's innovations, such as armor, aviation, and elastic defense. Their shortcomings became especially apparent in the campaign against Soviet Russia. Some generals lacked the boldness, initiative, and raw nerve to outthink, outmaneuver, and outfight such an imposing military Goliath and were dismissed. Replacing them were often men from ordinary backgrounds. Hitler himself stated in January 1944, more than 60% of the new officer corps rose through the ranks, creating a bridge to the hundreds of thousands of workers, farmers, and members of the lesser middle class. Though deprived of imperial privilege, the scions of Germany's distinguished families retained their ancestral honors and found the same path of opportunity open to them as to all of their countrymen. Most men of their younger generation dutifully entered frontline service during World War II, doing credit to their traditional standing. The inveterate conservatives and reactionaries among the aristocracy gravitated to the diplomatic corps and to the general staff, where they could inflict maximum damage to the German cause at minimal risk. Solitary and aloof, the resistance movement allied itself with the only group capable of destroying the social revolution that had transformed Germany, the enemy. To topple a form of government, the subversives accepted the enemy's war aims, with all the consequences for their own country. During a session with the Western Allies in Madrid on April 17, 1944, the conspirator Otto John asked that the demand for unconditional surrender be rescinded. The Anglo-American representatives replied that they intend to allow the Russians to be the first to invade Germany and enter Berlin. The Germans deserved to be punished, they maintained, and the job was better left to the Soviets. The Russians discharged the task as follows. In October 1944, the German Fourth Army repulsed an offensive towards Königsberg in East Prussia by the Soviet 11th Guards Army. Recapturing Nemersdorf, German soldiers discovered 72 murdered civilians, including the ravaged bodies of young women whom the Russians had nailed to barn doors. In Schilmeisen in the Memel territory, the German artillery gunner Erich Schurkes was among the counterattacking troops re-entering the village, which was his hometown. This is what he discovered after the withdrawal of the Soviet 93rd Rifle Corps. I found my father in a barn, lying face down with a bullet hole in his neck. In a stall lay dead a man and a woman with their hands tied behind their back, both bound together by a rope. In another farm, we saw 5 children with their tongues nailed to a large table. Despite a desperate search, I found no trace of my mother. While looking, we saw 5 girls bound together with rope. Their clothing was completely stripped and their backs badly lacerated. It appeared the girls had been dragged a long distance. The Germans documented countless other atrocities. The Soviets renewed the invasion of East Prussia in January 1945. They surrounded Königsberg. The German army conducted a relief operation beginning on February 19. Several German divisions, including the 5th Panzer, simultaneously attacked outward from the invested city, in the town of Mettgitten. Advancing troops recovered the bodies of 32 women whom the Russians had raped, murdered, and thrown into a shell crater. Master Sergeant Kurt Göring, a German tank commander participated in the attack, offered this testimony. Then we reached the Mettgitten. We were appalled to see what had happened there. At the rail station was a refugee train standing on the tracks with women and young girls. They had all been raped and murdered, and we wrote on the side of the rail car, "Avenge Mettgitten." The fighting went on without quarter. Another eyewitness participating in local German counterattacks was Sergeant Gunther Adam, who recalled this. We attacked and recaptured a town displaying the same crimes of these beasts. On a snow-covered, trampled-down village street was what remained of a young woman. It looked as though she had been wearing a fur coat. She was lying on her back, her arms and legs outstretched. The Soviets had run her over with a tank and crushed her, and the bloody, ground-up mass was frozen solid, and the most horrible thing I ever saw during the war. In a house, we found some men who had been beaten to death, and blood-soaked beds were ravaged women who were still alive. Then, worst of all, we found the head of a baby spiked on a bedpost. Red Army units overrunning German POW camps ruthlessly impressed the Russian inmates into first-wave infantry battalions, or treated them as deserters. At the Alt-Drowitz camp, they fired on 30 American prisoners whom the German guards had failed to evacuate, killing some. This was the Soviet army which Stauffenberg, Albrecht, and their associates enabled to enter Germany. The Western powers also waged war against German civilians, but from the air. In July 1943, the British Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army's 8th Air Force conducted several nearly consecutive bombing missions against Hamburg. In the bombardment, 30,482 residents perished by being blown apart, incinerated, asphyxiated, or buried by rubble. Among them were 5,586 children. Fires destroyed 24 hospitals, 277 schools, and 58 churches. An officer assisting in the evacuation of refugees described how some passenger cars carried gray-haired children, aged practically overnight from the terrors of the raid. Among the eyewitnesses was Gerard Bucharest of the resistance movement. In a Hamburg suburb, he watched the approach of the English bombers from his rooftop. Finally, I shouted, too long have I waited for the Allies to destroy the world enemy, Hitler. What horror, what sorrow, I naturally thought back then, but also, you dead want it this way. And who did I worry about during the attack? The pilots. They were valiant and did what I had hoped of them. After the war, the U.S. Army conducted a survey of German morale, responding to the query about what caused the population the greatest suffering under Hitler. And 91% of Germans who were polled cited the Allied air raids. Just 2% completing the questionnaire marked the loss of freedom or Nazi crimes. July 20 demonstrated that thoughts about high treason had no roots in the majority of the people. Schwarz von Berg summarized, what deprived the would-be usurpers of the last grain of sympathy was the clearly apparent intention of those involved not to risk their lives for what they claimed was an urgent necessity in the interests of their country, but to personally survive and satisfy their ambition for future positions of authority. This SS officer also emphasized that the Gestapo was not the force that maintained cohesion and kept the Germans in line. This, he argued, was an illusion nurtured among those opposing the government. The people and the troops fought bitterly and doggedly in the awareness that this struggle was literally a question of national and personal existence, especially on the Eastern Front. There were as good as no deserters in the front lines. There were practically no saboteurs on the workbenches in the armaments factories at home. The nation stood as never before in common cause, summoning all its moral strength to survive. Of the 70 military officers implicated in the plot to overthrow or assassinate Hitler, 55 were aristocrats. This class-conscious clique resorted to sabotage, treason, and murder to achieve its ends. Also dissatisfied with elements of the Reich's foreign and domestic policies were members of the Waffen-SS. Youthful and idealistic, they fought both to preserve their continent from foreign invasion and for revolutionary change, not to restore anachronistic distinctions in title and rank of the former imperial age. The SS men promoted their social and political agenda through loyalty, service, and sacrifice. They gained influence through courage and commitment, working with the legal framework to reform rather than destroy the existing order. They were prepared to give up more than they expected to gain as individuals, for the benefit and growth of the European community. A comparison of two persons, one an icon of the resistance and another an ordinary German infantryman, illuminates the essence of the contrast. The son of a prominent psychiatrist, Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, covertly assisted the Abwehr in its intrigues against the German cause. His relatives traded profitably on the black market. Visiting Geneva in 1941, he told fellow clerics, "The Christian faith must be rescued, even if an entire nation must perish." He apparently saw no contradiction in aiding the Soviets. I pray for the defeat of my fatherland. Nowhere near the fighting front, Bonhoeffer occasionally traveled and enjoyed a comfortable existence until April 1943, when the authorities jailed him for undermining the war effort. In August 1940, the 17-year-old Fritz Hall volunteered for the Waffen-SS, assigned to the Viking Division. He saw his first action against the Red Army on July 1, 1941. During the balance of war, Hall was on the front line 861 days. He suffered 7 wounds in combat. He wrote after the war, "Today I can no longer comprehend how, as a young man from 17 to 22 years of age, I found the strength to keep my self-control again and again, to conquer my fears and then continue fighting, and despite the setbacks still believe in a good outcome. One argument alone determined my actions and those of my generation. Together with my troops, like all German soldiers, we wanted to protect our homeland with its women and children from the Soviets, and without regard for ourselves." Upon Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied occupational forces began the mass arrest, interrogation, and imprisonment of thousands of Germans who had been variously affiliated with the National Socialist government. Among those detained was the renowned authority on international law, Friedrich Grimm. 10 years before, Hitler had solicited his counsel when planning to reinstitute compulsory military service. Now Grimm sat opposite an Allied officer who showed him samples of new leaflets printed by the victors. They were in German language for distribution throughout the conquered country. Describing German war crimes, the flyers were the first step in the re-education program designed for Germany. Grimm suggested that since the war was over, it was time to stop the libel. Why, no, we're just getting started, the officer replied. We'll continue this atrocity campaign. We'll increase it till no one will want to hear a good word about the Germans anymore. Till whatever sympathy there is for you in other countries is completely destroyed, and until the Germans themselves become so mixed up they won't know what they're doing. The perpetual campaign of negative publicity kept old wounds open for decades. To this day, it precludes objective analysis of a system developed by one of our most advanced, productive, and creative civilizations, which raised it from economic distress and social discord after World War I to prosperity and harmony within a few short years. In the aftermath of the 1939 to 1945 war, which deeply scarred the countries that fought, decimating the younger generation of some, there is merit in exploring notable elements of the ideologies involved. The lessons learned may contribute to a better understanding amongst peoples for the future. With respect to Germany, much can be gained from investigating not just what Hitler did, but why. Condemning the National Socialist state as a criminal abomination was the precursor to the present mindset that non-democratic governments are unenlightened at best, as tyrannies withholding freedom from the population or as rogue states. To esteem liberal democracy as humanity's crowning political achievement leads to complacency, diminishing in its supporters the critical eye so useful for correction and improvement. Reform is a product of restlessness and dissatisfaction. This was the genesis of the Enlightenment, the intellectual challenge of the royal regimen that had barred the common people from opportunity. First to give political expression to new ideas were the American colonists, unaccustomed to immoderate authority, and the French, spirited and self-assured. Their government shifted focus to advancing the individual, contrary to the monarchical structure of maintaining the control of an exclusive, self-serving minority. In Germany, the Enlightened Age evolved differently. The Germans' contemplative, methodical approach led to a gradual integration of liberal values with elements of the old order. Flanked by powerful neighboring states, a strong central authority was still necessary to preserve national independence. Together with the unification of the Reich in 1871, liberalism enabled the Germans to mature and prosper. The royal house, unable to keep pace with the progress of the times, failed dismally in foreign policy and at waging war, and ultimately vanished in 1918. The Weimar Republic, shackled by crippling tribute to the Allies, was unable to restore prosperity. Dissatisfied, the Germans turned to a new ideology. When Hitler came to power, which was by no means an easy and rapid process, he more or less occupied a political vacuum. He reached beyond democracy or the imperial era, reviving ideas of the German intellectual movement of the early 19th century. The National Socialists promoted individual liberty, but not a laissez-faire policy regarding commerce. Profit and advancement at the expense of the community they considered detrimental and discordant. Liberalism indeed paved the way for economic progress, but simultaneously abetted the social fragmentation of nations, concluded the protocol of the Science of Labor Institute's conference at Bad Salzburg in March 1944. The starting point for any orderly society is the people's collective good. It subordinates all individual interests. It ensures life and progress of the personality. Social policy can therefore not be limited to serve only the momentary advantage of particular persons or groups. Performing one's duty to work was the prerequisite for belonging to the national community and benefiting from citizenship. This complemented the traditional German work ethic, which seeks fulfillment in creative endeavor and industriousness. The National Socialists defined education as opening the road to social advancement. Among the academic institutions were leadership schools. These based enrollment more on the sound moral character of the pupil than on scholastic performance. Stressing patriotism and communal service, discouraging egocentric or elitist attitudes, educators trained the young to place the welfare of all before personal gain, to respect group achievement over individual accomplishment. In this way, they hoped to produce future leaders who would not abuse their authority, but sincerely regard the public trust as a sacred responsibility. These were values applicable for both political careers and in private enterprise. No matter how promising a state form may appear on paper, the integrity of the men in charge significantly determines the benefit of its programs. Though he set the standards for the social and political structure of the new Germany, Hitler afforded subordinates considerable latitude to implement fresh ideas and modifications. He allowed competition among government agencies with overlapping jurisdiction. He intervened only after the rivals had demonstrated the strengths and weaknesses of their opposing viewpoints, and then usually in favor of the more revolutionary solution. Encouraging initiative, Hitler inspired unconventional thinking and risk-taking from those in authority. Thus, he backed Fritz Reinhardt's novel economic proposals against those of the conformist Schnacht. The Fuhrer cast his lot with Robert Ley after years of his DAF leaders grappling with the conservative labor ministry over increasing expenditures to improve workers' social warfare. He approved founding the Adolf Hitler schools with disregarded the Ministry of Education's curriculum and didn't even teach the NSDAP program. Himself a nationalist, Hitler did not interfere as the Waffen-SS gradually dismantled nationalism and challenged the racial policy of the National Socialist policy. At times, the German leader actually seemed reluctant to exercise the power he possessed. Even during wartime military conferences with the generals of his staff, some of whom he considered cowards, the Fuhrer seldom dropped the hammer. Adjutant Colonel Bellow wrote, Hitler rarely gave a direct order. He confined himself to persuading his listeners so that they would come to the same point of view. After December 1941, when Hitler took command of the army, he only gradually accomplished his purposes through direct orders. He still tried to win conference participants for his intentions, in part through lengthy explanations. Hitler sometimes displayed a willingness to acquiesce to contradictory viewpoints, demonstrating the latitude he granted party and state functionaries. In 1933, Reinhardt's Now program offered young women financial incentives to leave their jobs to marry and start families. This enabled out-of-work men to fill the vacated positions, helping relieve unemployment. Once the workforce was fully employed, the government continued sponsoring programs to keep women in the home, both to promote traditional family life and to maintain a healthy national birth rate. To be sure, prior to 1933, Hitler had already warned the NSDAP's male members that he would not tolerate any further perceptions of women as baby-making machines or playthings. As Chancellor, he facilitated opportunities for the female gender to pursue vocational careers, though restricting them from politics. Germany still maintained certain previous discrepancies, however, such as reduced salaries for women performing the same job as men. During World War II, German women filled many positions in the armaments industry on a lower wage scale as more males entered military service. In April 1944, Ley, who had campaigned for equal pay for women for years, confronted Hitler on the subject. The Fuhrer explained that Germany's planned post-war social structure envisions women as the hub of the family, adding that this does not imply a negative opinion of their intelligence or occupational capability. Ley retorted that successful German women have a modern cognizance of their role in society and consider Hitler's ideas archaic. In the course of the meeting, Ley tenaciously defended his stand against an avalanche of counterarguments his leader presented. The Fuhrer finally relented by offering a compromise, that women should receive less base pay but be eligible for incentive rewards and bonuses to compensate for the disparity. In general, Hitler's personal view had little influence on developments. In the winter semester of 1943 to 44, for example, 49.5% of students enrolled in German universities were women. In most governments, politicians promising reform are the least anxious to implement it. Few of them wish to improve a system throughout which they attained prominence. Those who succeed in a particular political milieu are the mortal enemies of change. Hitler stood against this custom. A child of the working class, he led the NSDAP to power without compromising with democratic factions in the Weimar Republic. Once chancellor, he owed no loyalty to the political parties entrenched in the government or to special interest groups in industry and commerce. Though consolidating his authority, Hitler did not create a system designed to perpetuate it. Through frequent public speeches, he used his station to inspire the Germans with love of country, appreciation for the nobility of work, and a sense of belonging. He believed that once these values guided his countrymen, it would be possible to gradually relax state controls. The government's role was not to secure the continuous supremacy of a dominant party or class, but to discover society's more creative and trustworthy elements and promote their careers. This was to be an eternal process, guaranteeing that fresh blood and new ideas steadily flow forth from the wellspring of the population. Wrote the philosopher Nietzsche, who had endeavored so ardently to kindle the German psyche, when a nation genuinely leaps forward and grows, each time it bursts the cordon that had till then defined its repute and standing as a people. But when a nation retains much that is fixed, then this is proof that it prefers to stagnate. The Enlightenment instructed mankind that governments deserve obedience only insofar as they discharge their responsibility to serve the public. In democracy, Western civilization believes it has achieved the state structure that holds those in power to this obligation. Liberal nations more or less abide by this arrangement, no longer exploring or tolerating alternatives. Somewhere in their development, they stop short of the comprehension that no single form of government is best for every age or every culture. To be truly representative, a system must conform to the character and requirements of the people in its charge and not vice versa. Hitler also accepted liberalism as important for nurturing the inventive impulse of humanity. He wanted each generation to advance and mature, each individual motivated to realize his or her potential while rising together as a community. He demanded two prerequisites: one, that society become educated in the spirit of civic responsibility, and two, that the state encourage profound reverence for German history, art, and ethnic traditions, to keep his countrymen on the evolutionary course that molded them into a proud and unified people. The historically maligned leader of National Socialist Germany interpreted the duty of government as to foster, never restrict, the creative energy of a nation and to expedite its progress. For without progress there is no future, and in the future rests the hope for a better life. This was the substance of Hitler's revolution.